some wounds never heal, they just learn to stay quiet. Elijah Tull had made peace with his ghosts 20 winters ago, when the blizzard took his wife and baby girl. Now his dog Copper was barking at an old cabin that wasn't there yesterday. The grey-bearded mountain man trusted his hound's instincts. Inside that forgotten place, he found a child's drawing on the wall and a woman's shawl on the cot. Both looked exactly like what his lost family left behind. The world said they were gone forever. But if that's true, how did their things end up here? What really happened to his family all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp against Elijah Tull's weathered cheeks as he stepped from his cabin, boots crunching on frost that painted the sage silver. 20 winters of solitude had carved deep lines around his eyes, but they were kind lines, the sort that came from watching sunrises nobody else would see and finding peace in the company of wind and stone. His beard, more salt than pepper now, caught the early light as he stretched muscles that had grown accustomed to the mountain's demands. Copper bounded ahead, his red coat bright against the muted landscape. The dog had been Elijah's only companion these long years, arriving as a half-starved pup during that terrible second winter after Sarah and Emma vanished. Someone had told him once that dogs could sense grief the way they sense storms coming. Maybe that's why Copper had wandered up to his door, whimpering and shivering, as if he'd known a broken man when he saw one. "Morning, old friend," Elijah murmured, running a hand along Copper's flanks as the dog pressed against his leg. The ritual never changed. Check the water barrel for ice, split kindling for the day's fire, and walk the perimeter of his small world, the cabin, the shed, the garden plot, where he'd once dreamed of teaching Emma to grow tomatoes. The wedding ring hung heavy on its chain beneath his flannel shirt, Sarah's gold band warm against his chest. He'd worn it there since the day the search parties gave up, when the sheriff had shaken his head and spoken words like "presumed dead" and "time to accept." Elijah had accepted nothing. He'd simply retreated to this ridge, where the wind carried no voices but its own, where memories could settle like snow and stay undisturbed. Dead Horse Ridge earned its name honestly. The bones of pack animals still littered the approaches, mules and horses that had tried to cross during storms, their skeletons picked clean and bleached white by decades of weather. It was a hard place, unforgiving to those who didn't respect its moods. But Elijah understood hard places. He'd learned that grief, like altitude, demanded its own kind of breathing. The cabin he'd built sat tucked against a natural windbreak, of pine and granite, positioned so he could see anyone approaching from 3 directions. Old habits died hard, even for a man who'd left the army 30 years behind. The structure was solid, hand-hewn logs, chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, windows placed to catch the morning light Sarah had always loved. He'd built it as a retreat, a place where they could escape the bustle of town life in Millfield during summers. Now it was his whole world. Sarah Elizabeth Tull. Even her name felt like a prayer when he thought it. She'd been the schoolteacher in Millfield, a woman who could make even the surliest rancher's boy want to learn his letters. Brown hair that caught Copper in the sunlight, laugh lines that deepened when she read Emma bedtime stories. She'd been 26 when they married, full of plans for the future, dreams of children and garden parties, and growing old together on the front porch. Emma had been 3 when the storm took them. 3 years of wonder and questions and tiny hands reaching for everything. She'd called him Papa Bear because of his beard, would climb onto his lap while he carved wooden toys by the fire. The last thing he'd made for her was a little doll, with button eyes and yarn hair. He'd been planning to give it to her for Christmas. Instead, he'd held it through those first terrible months, until Copper arrived, and he'd finally put it away in the trunk with Sarah's things. The blizzard had come in February, one of those mountain storms that struck without warning and buried the world in white fury. Sarah had taken Emma to visit her sister in Millfield, a journey they'd made dozens of times before. The road was good, the weather clear when they'd left, but the mountains made their own rules about weather, and that storm had rewritten every map Elijah thought he knew. They'd found the wagon 3 days later, overturned in a ravine 5 miles from town. The horses were dead, still in their traces. Sarah and Emma were nowhere to be found. The search had gone on for weeks, volunteers from 3 counties, tracking dogs, even a few crow trackers who knew the country better than anyone. Nothing. It was as if the storm had swallowed them whole. Elijah had searched long after everyone else gave up. He'd scoured every canyon, every hidden valley, every place where 2 people might seek shelter from the killing cold. He'd found nothing but his own footprints and the echo of his own voice calling their names. Eventually, even he had to accept what the evidence suggested, that somewhere in the vast wilderness beyond Dead Horse Ridge, Sarah and Emma had succumbed to cold and exposure, their bodies claimed by wolves or weather. The town had tried to help at first. Neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy. The preacher offered comfort about God's mysterious ways. But Elijah couldn't stomach their well-meaning kindness. How could he sit in church pews and nod along to sermons about divine plans when his 3-year-old daughter was feeding worms in some unmarked grave? How could he make small talk about weather and crop prices when every conversation felt like betrayal of their memory? So he'd retreated to the ridge, selling the house in town and most of what they'd owned. He'd kept only what mattered: Sarah's books, Emma's clothes, the tools he'd need to survive alone. The ridge became his monastery, grief his only religion. 20 years was a long time to live with ghosts, long enough to learn their schedules, to know which memories would visit on which days. The anniversary of Emma's birth always brought the sound of her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Christmas Eve summoned Sarah's voice, humming carols while she cooked. Spring thaws unearthed the smell of her hair. Summer storms carried the weight of her hand in his. But Elijah had found a kind of peace in the routine of solitude. Dawn brought coffee and contemplation. Days brought the honest work of maintaining his small world. Evenings brought the satisfaction of labor completed, and another day survived. Copper provided companionship without conversation, presence without pity. Together, they'd built a life that honored memory without drowning in it. The dog had grown into a fine animal, loyal, intelligent, with instincts sharp as winter wind. He'd earned his keep hunting rabbits and alerting to bears, but more than that, he'd become the only witness to Elijah's daily resurrection from sorrow. Every morning when Elijah woke, Copper was there with eyes that held no judgment, only the promise of another day's companionship. Other people were rare visitors to Dead Horse Ridge. Occasionally a hunter would wander through, or a government surveyor mapping mineral claims. Elijah was polite but distant with such visitors, offering coffee and directions but little conversation. They called him the Hermit of Dead Horse Ridge, spoke of him in town with mixture of pity and respect. Let them talk. He had no need for their opinions or their company. The ridge provided everything necessary for survival. A spring that never ran dry, game trails that brought deer and elk within rifle range, timber for fuel and shelter. His garden, carefully tended and protected from deer by high fencing, yielded enough vegetables to supplement meat and fish. He made annual trips to town for supplies, coffee, flour, ammunition, but these expeditions felt increasingly foreign, as if he were visiting a planet where everyone spoke a language he'd forgotten. That morning had started like any other. Coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead, breakfast of venison and cornbread eaten while watching the sun paint the eastern peaks gold. He'd planned to repair the shed roof, check his snares, maybe fish the beaver pond if the ice had melted enough. Simple tasks for a simple life, but Copper had other ideas. The dog had been restless since first light, pacing and whining, looking toward the southern slope, where the old logging roads wound through deadfall and granite outcrops. It wasn't like him to be unsettled without cause. In 20 years together, Elijah had learned to trust the dog's instincts about weather, wildlife, and the rare human visitor. "What is it, boy?" Elijah asked, studying Copper's alert posture. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his tail still as a weather vane. Something had caught his attention, something that made his hackles rise despite the peaceful morning. Following Copper's gaze, Elijah scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. The morning was clear, the air still enough that smoke from his chimney rose straight as a prayer. No wind to carry scents or sounds that might explain the dog's agitation. But Copper knew this country as well as Elijah did, and if something was different, it bore investigating. "All right then," Elijah said, reaching for his jacket and rifle. "Let's go see what's got you so worked up." The routine of 20 years was about to end, though Elijah had no way of knowing it as he followed his dog down the mountain toward whatever waited in the shadows of the deadfall. Some mornings changed everything. This was one of them. The cabin materialized from the morning mist, like something born from memory itself. Elijah stopped dead in his tracks, rifle balanced in the crook of his arm, staring at a structure that shouldn't exist. He'd walked these slopes for 20 years, knew every boulder and game trail, every stand of timber and clearing. This clapboard building, sagging against a backdrop of pine and granite, had no business being here. "Easy now," he whispered to Copper, though the words were as much for himself as the dog. Copper's growl rumbled low in his throat, a warning that raised the hair on Elijah's neck. The dog had frozen in a perfect point, muscles coiled tight as watch springs. The cabin was old, that much was clear from 50 yards away. Weather-beaten boards had warped and split, leaving gaps that let mountain wind whistle through like a rusty harmonica. The roof sagged under the weight of accumulated debris, and morning frost gave the whole structure a ghostly sheen. But old didn't explain its presence. Elijah knew this country better than he knew his own reflection, and yesterday there had been nothing here but deadfall and deer trails. Moving closer, boots careful on the uneven ground, Elijah noticed details that made his chest tighten. A stone chimney, partially collapsed, but built with the same careful craftsmanship his own father had taught him. Window frames that held fragments of glass, catching sunlight like broken promises. A door that hung askew on leather hinges, the kind of repair work a man made when proper hardware wasn't available. Copper's agitation increased as they approached. The dog's hackles stood stiff as porcupine quills, and his breathing came in short, controlled bursts, the way he breathed when tracking wounded game. Something inside that cabin had his full attention, something that triggered every hunting instinct bred into his bones. "Hello, the cabin!" Elijah called, voice carrying across the small clearing. The mountain protocols demanded it. You never approached another man's shelter without announcing yourself, no matter how abandoned it appeared. Silence answered him, broken only by wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. The door frame revealed darkness beyond, shadows deep enough to hide anything. Elijah stepped onto a porch that groaned under his weight, boards soft with rot in places. Copper pressed close to his leg, still growling that low warning. Whatever waited inside had the dog spooked worse than he'd been since that encounter with the wounded grizzly 2 springs back. Inside, the cabin's single room stretched maybe 12 feet square, dim and musty, with the smell of old wood and something else, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. Shafts of sunlight leaked through roof gaps, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting everything in amber half-light. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes scattered across the hearth. A rough-hewn table sat beneath the single window, its surface scarred with use. In the corner, a simple cot with rope supports and a straw mattress gone grey with age. But it was the wall opposite the fireplace that stopped Elijah's heart. There, drawn in faded but still visible colors, was a child's picture. Crayon on bare wood, the work of small hands guided by imagination rather than skill. A house with a crooked chimney smoking blue, a tree with branches like green fireworks, a sun with rays shooting in all directions. And beneath the tree, 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall one, a smaller one with long hair and a tiny one between them. The picture was exactly like the ones Emma used to draw, down to the way she made the sun's rays extend past the paper's edges. The same primitive style, the same joyful confidence in every line. But Emma had been gone 20 years. This cabin shouldn't exist, and even if it did, her drawings shouldn't be decorating its walls. Elijah's hands shook as he reached toward the picture, then stopped. Touching it might make it disappear, might prove it was nothing more than his loneliness playing tricks with light and shadow. But the drawing remained solid, real, impossible, as a prayer answered by the wrong god. On the cot lay a shawl, folded with care despite the cabin's obvious abandonment. Blue wool with a pattern of small white flowers, the kind of delicate work Sarah had loved to do during long winter evenings. Elijah knew that shawl. He'd saved money for 2 months to buy the yarn, had watched Sarah's face light up when he'd presented it for her birthday. She'd worn it the morning they'd left for Millfield, wrapped against the February cold that had seemed so manageable then. Copper whined, a sound of distress that brought Elijah back to the present. The dog was pawing at a loose floorboard near the far wall, claws scratching against wood with urgent intensity. Following the dog's lead, Elijah knelt and pried at the board with his knife. The wood came up easily, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside lay a wooden doll. Elijah's vision blurred as he lifted the small figure from its hiding place. Button eyes and yarn hair, carved from pine and smoothed by loving hands. It was identical to the one he'd made for Emma, down to the tiny dress painted in red and blue. But this couldn't be the same doll that one was safe in the trunk back home, wrapped in tissue paper and protected from time's touch. Yet here it was, or its twin, hidden beneath the floorboards of a cabin that couldn't exist, in a place where his daughter had never been. The world tilted sideways. 20 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled like sandcastles before a wave. Elijah sank onto the edge of the cot, doll cradled in his weathered hands, trying to make sense of evidence that defied everything he knew to be true. Emma was dead. Sarah was dead. He'd searched for them until his body gave out and his hope turned to ash. The search teams had found nothing because there was nothing to find. 2 people claimed by winter's hunger, their bodies lost to wolves and weather. He'd built his life around that terrible certainty, had learned to breathe around the weight of it. But if they were gone, how had their things ended up here? How had Emma's drawing appeared on a wall that shouldn't exist? How had Sarah's shawl come to rest on a cot in a cabin that hadn't been here yesterday? Copper's sharp bark brought him to his feet. The dog stood rigid at the cabin's single window, staring out at something in the trees. Elijah joined him, peering through glass clouded with age and grime. Fresh footprints marked the soft earth beyond the porch. Boot prints, medium-sized, leading away from the cabin toward the deeper forest. Someone had been here recently enough that frost hadn't yet filled the depressions left by their passage. The prints headed south, following an old game trail that wound through a maze of deadfall and granite boulders. Whoever had made them knew this country, knew how to move through difficult terrain without leaving obvious signs of passage. But Elijah had learned tracking from his grandfather, who'd learned it from crow hunters who could follow a ghost through solid rock. These prints told a story, if he had the courage to read it. Someone had visited this cabin within the last day, maybe the last few hours. They'd been careful to approach from downwind, staying in shadow where possible. The depth and spacing of the tracks suggested unhurried movement, not someone fleeing, but someone with purpose and destination in mind. Standing there in that impossible cabin, holding his daughter's doll while his dead wife's shawl lay folded on the cot, Elijah faced a choice that would define whatever years remained to him. He could walk away, return to his ridge and his routines and his carefully maintained grief. He could pretend this cabin was a dream, these artifacts, mirages born from too much solitude and too little hope. Or he could follow those footprints wherever they led, even if the trail ended in madness or heartbreak, or truths too large for one man's shoulders to bear. Copper looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only the patient loyalty of a friend prepared to follow wherever the path might lead. The dog had brought him here for a reason, had sensed something that defied explanation but demanded investigation. Elijah slipped the wooden doll into his jacket pocket, feeling its weight settle against his ribs like a promise. Sarah's shawl went over his shoulder, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and memories. Whatever truth waited at the end of those footprints, he would face it. 20 years of questions deserved whatever. Answers the mountain was finally ready to provide. "Come on, boy," he said to Copper, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Let's see where this trail leads." The hunt for his lost family was beginning again. The footprints led Elijah through country that grew wilder with each step. Ancient pines towered overhead like cathedral pillars, their branches filtering sunlight into scattered coins of gold that danced across the forest floor. Copper moved beside him with the focused intensity of a hunter, nose to the ground, following scents that meant nothing to human senses but spoke volumes to canine understanding. The trail wound through a landscape carved by time and weather, over granite shelves polished smooth by centuries of snowmelt, around boulder fields that had tumbled from distant peaks, through stands of aspen where autumn's last leaves whispered secrets to the wind. Whoever had made these tracks knew this territory intimately, choosing the easiest routes, through difficult terrain, avoiding the deadfalls and washouts that could trap an unwary traveler. After 2 hours of steady walking, the prince led to a natural shelter formed by a massive granite overhang. The space beneath the stone roof stretched back 15 feet, dry and protected from weather. Someone had used this place recently. The remains of a small fire lay carefully banked in a ring of stones, ashes still holding faint warmth when Elijah knelt to test them with his palm. But it was what lay hidden behind a carefully stacked pile of stones that stopped his breath entirely. Wrapped in oiled canvas and tucked into a natural crevice in the rock wall was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Elijah's hands trembled as he unwrapped the bundle, recognizing the distinctive tooling on the leather roses and vines worked by hand, the same pattern Sarah had admired in the general store window back in Millfield. The journal fell open to pages covered in familiar handwriting, the careful script he'd watched Sarah use to write letters to her sister, to record Emma's first words and milestones. But the dates made his vision swim. The most recent entry was barely a week old. Asterisk October 15th, 1893, asterisk asterisk. Another winter approaches, and I find myself thinking more and more of the life we might have had. Emma asks about her father constantly now. She remembers so little, but the few memories she holds are precious to her. How can I explain that I believed him dead all these years? How can I tell her that fear kept me from searching for the truth? Asterisk, asterisk. The Guardian says it's still not safe to return. Thomas Carver's men have been asking questions in the settlements again, following the old trails. But Emma is 23 now, with children of her own, and she deserves to know her heritage. She deserves to meet her father, if he still draws breath. Asterisk, asterisk. I pray daily that Elijah found peace in his grief. I pray equally that he's alive to find joy in what we've preserved. Asterisk. The journal slipped from Elijah's nerveless fingers, pages fluttering in the mountain breeze. Sarah alive, Emma grown, with children. The words hammered against his consciousness like hail on a tin roof, each impact driving reality deeper into uncharted territory. With shaking hands, he retrieved the journal and forced himself to read more carefully. The entries stretched back 20 years, chronicling a life lived in careful hiding. Early entries spoke of terror and confusion, of waking in a place called Haven Valley with no memory of how she'd arrived there. A man called the Guardian had found her and Emma in the aftermath of the blizzard, more dead than alive, and brought them to safety. Asterisk, February 28th, 1873. Asterisk, asterisk. The Guardian explained today why we cannot return home. The storm was no accident. Men working for the Carver Mining Company set charges to trigger the avalanche that blocked the main road. They meant to strand travelers, to create accidents that would leave land claims available for corporate purchase. Emma and I survived only by pure chance, thrown clear when our wagon overturned, but they believe us dead along with the others. Asterisk, asterisk. I ache to return to Elijah, but the Guardian insists it would mean death for all of us. Until Thomas Carver's influence wanes, we must remain among the lost. Asterisk, page after page, revealed the careful construction of a hidden life. Sarah had taught children in Haven Valley, a secret settlement of families who'd been displaced or threatened by Carver's expansion. Emma had grown up among people who understood the value of invisibility, learning to read, sign, and move through wilderness like her ancestors had. Asterisk, March 15th, 1875. Asterisk, asterisk. Emma asked about her father today. She remembers his beard, his gentle hands, the way he used to carve animals from wood scraps. I told her he was the finest man I'd ever known, brave and kind and strong. She wants to meet him someday. How my heart breaks at her innocent faith that such a day will come. Asterisk, asterisk. The Guardian brought news that Elijah still lives on Dead Horse Ridge, alone except for a red dog. He's become something of a legend among the mountain people, the hermit of the ridge, they call him. They speak of him with respect, saying he bothers no one, but extends occasional help to travelers in need. My love endures his grief in solitude, while I nurse mine in hiding. Asterisk. The later entries grew more complex as Emma matured. She'd married a young man named Robert Martinez, one of the displaced family's children. Their first child, a daughter named Grace, had been born 2 years ago. A son called Michael had followed 18 months later. Asterisk, August 3rd, 1892. Asterisk, asterisk. Emma speaks more frequently of visiting her father. She's begun leaving signs, small things that might catch his attention if he ventures far enough from his ridge. A wooden doll carved in his style, left at an old shelter. Some of my drawings made by her childish hand, placed where they might survive weather, until he finds them. She hopes to build a trail of memories that might lead him to us, when the time is right. Asterisk, asterisk. I've tried to discourage this dangerous game, but Robert supports her. He says a grandchild deserves to know her heritage, that hiding has kept us safe, but may not keep us whole. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps 20 years of caution has become 20 years of cowardice. Asterisk. Elijah closed the journal and pressed his forehead against its worn cover. Sarah believed him alive, because he was, but she'd been alive too, raising their daughter in exile while he mourned their ghosts. 20 years of parallel grief, 20 years of unnecessary separation, all because of one man's greed and the fear it had spawned. Copper whined softly and nuzzled against his leg, offering comfort in the way dogs understood suffering. The animal's presence grounded him in the present moment, reminded him that however impossible the truth might seem, it demanded action rather than paralysis. The footprints continued beyond the shelter, leading deeper into wilderness that grew more remote with each mile. But now they carried different meaning. These weren't the tracks of strangers or threats. They belonged to his daughter, to the granddaughter he'd never met, perhaps to the son-in-law whose existence rewrote everything he thought he knew about his life. Standing beneath the granite overhang with Sarah's journal pressed against his chest, Elijah made a promise to the empty sky and listening forest. He would follow this trail wherever it led, through whatever dangers waited ahead. His family was alive, hidden but real, and 20 years of separation had been punishment enough for all of them. The hunt was no longer for answers to old questions. Now it was a race toward reunion, toward healing wounds that had festered too long in darkness and solitude. 3 miles deeper into the wilderness, where the game trails grew faint and the trees pressed close enough to block most of the afternoon sun, Elijah found the second cache. This one was hidden more carefully inside a hollow stump, concealed by a cunningly fitted piece of bark that looked natural unless examined closely. The handiwork spoke of patience and skill, the kind of attention to detail that came from years of practice at staying invisible. Copper had led him to it, nose twitching as he circled the stump with growing excitement. The dog's tail wagged now instead of bristling with alarm. Whatever sense he detected here carried familiarity rather than threat. When Elijah pried away the bark covering, he understood why. Inside the hollow lay a silver locket on a delicate chain, the kind of jewelry a grandmother might pass to her granddaughter. But this wasn't an heirloom, it was something far more precious and impossible. Elijah recognized the locket immediately. It had been Emma's first birthday present, a gift from Sarah's mother, who'd insisted that even a 1-year-old should have something beautiful of her own. His hands shook as he opened the tiny clasp. Inside, where a baby's portrait had once rested, now lay a photograph of a young woman holding 2 small children. The woman had Sarah's eyes and Emma's stubborn chin, but the face was that of a stranger. Emma, grown to adulthood, matured beyond the toddler memories that had sustained him through 20 years of grief. The photograph was recent, the paper still crisp, and the images sharp with modern clarity. Emma, for it could only be. Emma wore a simple dress and looked directly at the camera with confidence and poise. Her dark hair was pinned back in the practical style of frontier women, but her smile carried echoes of the joy he remembered from their last morning together. The children in her arms looked to be perhaps 2 and 3 years old, their faces round with health and curiosity. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in careful script, "Grace and Michael Martinez, with their mother, Emma. October 1893. Grace and Michael, his grandchildren, children who'd never known their grandfather existed, who'd grown from infancy without hearing the stories he'd planned to tell them or receiving the wooden toys he'd dreamed of making for them. The loss of those unshared years hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with the weight of all that time could never return. But beneath the grief lay something else, a fierce joy that burned through his chest like prairie fire. Emma lived. She'd grown into a woman of obvious strength and grace, had married and borne children of her own. The line continued. The future he'd thought severed by winter wind stretched ahead into possibilities he'd never dared imagine. Copper whined and pressed against his leg, sensing distress in ways that required no explanation. Elijah buried his face in the dog's red fur for a moment, letting the animal's warmth steady him against the emotional earthquake reshaping his world. When he finally raised his head, his vision had cleared enough to notice other items in the cache. A small bundle of letters tied with ribbon revealed correspondence between Emma and her mother, discussing plans and fears and the growing need to somehow contact the father. Emma barely remembered but desperately wanted to know. The most recent letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, spoke of a decision finally made. Mama. I can't wait any longer. Robert agrees that the children deserve to know their grandfather, and I need to meet the man who taught you what love looked like. The Guardian says it's still dangerous, but we've been careful for 20 years and nothing has changed except my patience running out. I'm going to leave signs where he might find them. Not obvious things that would draw Carver's attention, but memories that only Papa would recognize. The wooden doll from his own hands. Drawings like the ones I made as a child. Pieces of our life that might call to him if he ventures. Far enough from his ridge. If this works, if he follows the trail, you must be ready. He'll have questions that only you can answer. He'll need time to understand what we've become and why we stayed hidden. Most of all, he'll need to know that we never stopped loving him, not for 1 day in 20 years. Asterisk. A second letter, in different handwriting, Roberts. Presumably offered a man's perspective on the plan. Asterisk. Mrs. Tull. Emma's determination grows stronger each day. She speaks of her father constantly, tells the children stories about the grandfather they've never met. I've watched her leave those signs for months now, always hoping they'll reach the right eyes. If they do, if he comes looking, know that you'll have a son-in-law ready to welcome him home. The children need their grandfather, but more than that, Emma needs her father. Some wounds only heal when the family circle closes. Asterisk. Reading these letters, Elijah realized the cache represented more than just hidden supplies. It was a message system, a way for his scattered family to communicate across distances that made normal contact impossible. Emma had been leaving breadcrumbs for him to follow, hoping to build a bridge across 20 years of separation. The trail beyond the stump grew more deliberate now, marked with subtle signs that spoke of recent passage. A broken branch hung at shoulder height, its fresh break showing pale wood beneath the bark. Stones arranged in patterns that looked natural but followed geometric logic. Scratches on tree trunks that might have been made by wildlife but showed tool marks to trained eyes. Emma was leading him somewhere specific, using skills learned in 20 years of hiding to create a path that would be invisible to casual observers, but clear as highway signs to someone who knew how to read the wilderness. The care she'd taken with each marker spoke of intelligence and patience, traits inherited from both parents but sharpened by necessity into something approaching artistry. As afternoon shadows lengthened and the air grew crisp with approaching evening, Elijah pressed forward with renewed urgency. Sarah's journal had revealed the fact of their survival, but Emma's locket and letters added emotional weight that transformed abstract knowledge into personal reality. His daughter was out there somewhere, alive and well, and eager to bridge the gap that circumstances had forced between them. Copper trotted ahead with obvious enthusiasm, following scents that grew stronger with each mile. The dog seemed to understand they were tracking family rather than prey, approaching reunion rather than confrontation. His tail wagged constantly now, and he frequently looked back as if to confirm that Elijah was keeping pace with their important mission. The signs Emma had left grew more frequent as daylight faded, suggesting they were approaching whatever destination she'd chosen for this carefully orchestrated meeting. Each marker filled Elijah with growing anticipation and nervous energy. After 20 years of believing his family was dead, he was perhaps hours away from seeing his daughter again and meeting the grandchildren whose existence rewritten his understanding of his own life. Whatever lay ahead, whoever waited at the end of this trail, Elijah was ready to face the future that had been stolen from them all. The evening brought him to a natural clearing where ancient pines formed a cathedral circle around a small meadow. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, painting everything in silver and deep shadow. At the clearing's center sat the remains of a long-dead campfire, cold ashes scattered by wind and time. But beside the fire ring, placed with obvious intention on a flat stone, lay something that stopped Elijah's heart. A wooden chess piece, a king, carved from dark walnut and polished, smooth by handling. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, following techniques Elijah had learned from his own father and passed to Emma during those precious 3 years before the world came apart. Every curve and angle followed the style he'd developed over decades of carving, but the execution showed skills that had grown far beyond what a 3-year-old could manage. Emma had continued the tradition. Somewhere in the years of exile, she'd learned to finish what he'd started, had developed the patient hand and careful eye that turned wood into art. The chess piece sat there like a message across time, proof that his teachings had taken root, that part of him had lived on in her hands, even when they believed each other dead. Copper circled the clearing with growing excitement, nose to the ground as he followed scent trails that crisscrossed the meadow in complex patterns. The dog's behavior suggested recent activity. Multiple people had used this place within the last few days, possibly hours. This wasn't just another cache or message point, it was a gathering place. Somewhere, Emma and her family felt safe enough to linger. Elijah picked up the chess piece and felt memories flood through his fingers. Long winter evenings by the fire, teaching tiny hands to hold knife and wood safely. Emma's determined frown as she tried to copy his movements. Her delighted squeal when a rough shape finally resembled the animal she'd intended. The last piece they'd worked on together, a wooden horse with flowing mane, had been only half finished when she'd left for that final, fatal trip to Millfield. Or what he'd believed was fatal. Now, holding proof of skills developed in exile, he realized Emma had probably finished that horse. Had probably carved dozens more, hundreds more, maintaining connection with her lost father through the work of her hands. The weight of 20 wasted years settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. While he'd mourned their deaths, Emma had been growing up without him, learning to carve and hunt and survive in a world that demanded constant vigilance. She'd married and borne children who would grow up strangers to their grandfather unless something changed, unless he found courage to bridge the gap that fear and circumstances had created. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing's edge. Copper's head whipped toward the sound, ears pricked forward but tail still wagging, alert but not alarmed. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. 20 years of solitude, having taught him that night sounds in the wilderness deserved attention. "Easy, Papa Bear." The voice came from the shadows between two massive pines, soft and warm with affection that bridged 2 decades like it was 2 minutes. A woman stepped into the moonlight, moving with the confident grace of someone who'd learned to read forest darkness like daylight. She was tall like Sarah, with Elijah's stubborn jawline and eyes that held intelligence tempered by caution. Emma, his daughter. Alive and real, and standing close enough to touch. "You followed the signs," she said, voice steady despite the tears that caught moonlight on her cheeks. "I hoped you would, but I wasn't sure. 20 years is a long time to maintain faith in breadcrumbs." Elijah tried to speak and found his throat closed around words too large for his voice to carry. She was beautiful in the way Sarah had been beautiful, not magazine pretty, but radiating the kind of strength that made men want to build homes around it. Her dark hair was braided for practical work, and she wore clothes designed for movement through difficult country. Everything about her spoke of competence earned through hard experience. "I know this is strange," Emma continued, taking a careful step closer. "I know you thought we were dead. Mama will explain everything when it's safe, but right now Her voice broke slightly. "I just needed to see you, to know you were real, and not just stories I told my children about the grandfather they'd never met." Copper solved the emotional deadlock by trotting over to Emma and pressing his nose against her hand. She laughed, a sound like water over stones, and scratched behind his ears with the confidence of someone raised around working animals. "You must be Copper," she said to the dog. "Mama told me about you, said you found Papa when he needed a friend most." Finding his voice finally, Elijah managed 4 words that carried 20 years of questions and longing. "You look like her." "People say that," Emma replied, smiling through tears. "But I have your hands. See?" She held up her palms, showing calluses and scars that matched his own, the marks of someone who worked with wood and metal, who understood tools as extensions of will. "I kept carving. Had to teach myself mostly, but I remembered the basics you showed me." "The chess piece?" Elijah said, holding up the carved king. "One of dozens. I made a whole set over the years, thinking maybe someday we'd finish that game you started teaching me. Do you still play?" "No," he admitted. "Couldn't see the point without someone to play against." Emma's expression grew serious, and she looked back toward the trees, where darker shadows suggested other presences. "There are things you need to know before we go any further. Dangerous things. The man responsible for separating us is still alive, still hunting families like ours. Coming back into our lives puts you at risk too." "I don't care about risk," Elijah said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "I've lived with ghosts for 20 years. I'll take danger over emptiness any day. Even if it means leaving your ridge, your safe life?" Elijah looked at this daughter who'd grown into a woman without him, at the evidence of skills and strength developed through necessity rather than choice. "That wasn't a life," he said quietly. "It was just a long way of dying. If you'll have me back, if there's room in your world for an old mountain man who's forgotten how to live around people, then I'm yours for whatever time remains." Emma's smile transformed her face, erasing years of caution and uncertainty. "There's always room for family," she said. "But first, you need to meet someone." Emma led him through the trees to a hidden camp that spoke of careful planning and practiced concealment. Canvas tarps had been rigged between pines to create shelters that would be invisible from 50 feet away. A fire burned in a carefully constructed pit that directed smoke through a natural chimney formed by overhanging rocks. Everything showed the touch of people who'd learned to live without leaving traces. A young man rose from beside the fire as they approached, his movement careful but welcoming. He was perhaps 25, with the lean build of someone accustomed to hard work and the alert eyes of a man who'd learned to watch for trouble. When he smiled, Elijah saw genuine warmth beneath the caution. "Robert Martinez," the man said, extending his hand. "I've heard stories about you my whole life. It's an honor to finally meet Emma's father." His grip was firm, honest, the handshake of someone who understood the value of trust given and received. Emma moved to stand beside him with the easy intimacy of a couple who'd faced hardship together and emerged stronger for it. Watching them, Elijah saw the kind of partnership he'd shared with Sarah, two people who completed each other's thoughts and movements without conscious effort. "Robert's family came to Haven Valley when he was 12, Emma explained. His father was a surveyor who asked too many questions about Carver's mining claims. They made it clear he should stop asking or face consequences. My father chose exile over silence," Robert said simply. "Some fights are worth the cost of safety." Beyond the fire, movement caught Elijah's attention. Two small shapes emerged from the shadows of the makeshift shelters, children who'd been watching the adults with the careful attention. Kids learned when survival sometimes depended on staying quiet. A girl of perhaps 3, with Emma's dark hair and serious eyes. A boy, slightly younger, whose smile revealed the gap-toothed grin of childhood. Grace and Michael, his grandchildren. The sight of them hit him harder than any of the previous revelations. These were children who should have grown up hearing his voice, feeling his arms lift them to his shoulders, learning the songs and stories that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. Instead, they watched him with the polite caution of children meeting a stranger which, despite blood connection, was exactly what he was. Grace stepped forward first, her small hand reaching into the pocket of her coat. What she withdrew made Elijah's breath catch in his throat, a small book with a cover worn, soft by handling, pages yellowed with age and use. "Mama said you might want to see this," she said, her voice carrying the clear pronunciation of a child who'd been taught to speak carefully. "She reads it to us sometimes." The book was a Bible, but not just any Bible. This was Sarah's personal copy, the one she'd carried to church every Sunday, the one she'd used to teach Emma her letters during long winter evenings. The leather cover bore the distinctive pattern of roses and thorns that Sarah had loved, and the pages fell open automatically to passages marked by years of reading. But it was what lay pressed between the pages that stopped his heart. Wildflowers, carefully preserved, their colors faded, but still recognizable. Mountain, lupine, Indian paintbrush, columbine, the blooms Sarah had always gathered during their walks together, the ones she'd taught Emma to identify and appreciate. "She has a garden," Emma said softly, watching his face as he examined the pressed flowers. "Hidden in a valley about 2 miles from here. She's maintained it for 20 years, keeping the flowers we used to pick together. Says it helps her. Remember what we were like before the world got complicated." The flowers spoke of hope, maintained through decades of exile. While he'd believed her dead, Sarah had been nurturing life, keeping beauty alive in a hidden place where memory could bloom untended. Each pressed blossom represented a season survived, a year of faith that someday the scattered pieces of their family might reassemble. Robert moved to stir the fire, sending sparks dancing upward toward the canopy. "She wanted to come tonight," he said. "Has been planning this reunion for months." But the Guardian brought word that Carver's men have been active again, asking questions in the settlements, following old trails. "The Guardian?" Elijah asked. Emma and Robert exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that spoke of shared secrets and difficult decisions. Finally, Emma nodded slightly, and Robert continued. "Marcus Webb, former government agent who was investigating Carver's operation when everything went wrong 20 years ago. He saved Mama and you from the avalanche, brought them to Haven Valley. He's been protecting displaced families ever since, but it's getting more dangerous." "Carver's getting desperate," Emma added. "The easy mineral claims have been exhausted, and he's looking harder at land that's been deemed worthless, including Dead Horse Ridge." The words hit Elijah like cold water. His ridge, his sanctuary, the place where he'd built his life around grief and solitude, it was exactly the kind of isolated territory that would attract Carver's attention. Remote enough that accidents could happen without witnesses, valuable enough to justify whatever methods were necessary to acquire it. "He knows you're alive," Robert said quietly. "Has known for years, but left you alone because a hermit posed no threat to his plans. That's changing now. There are geological surveys that suggest significant copper deposits beneath your ridge, maybe silver too. That makes you a problem he'll need to solve." Grace had climbed onto Emma's lap while the adults talked, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air as she listened to conversations that shaped her world in ways she couldn't yet understand. Michael sat beside his father, whittling a small piece of wood with a knife sized for child hands, already learning the skills that connected him to generations of mountain craftsmen. Watching his grandchildren in the firelight, Elijah felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. These children deserved to grow up free from the fear that had shaped their parents' lives. They deserved to know their heritage without looking constantly over their shoulders for threats that should have died with the previous generation. "What does Webb suggest?" he asked. "That we disappear deeper into the wilderness," Emma replied. "Find new hiding places, start over again somewhere Carver can't follow, but I'm tired of running from a fight that was never really ours." And Robert agrees. "Some things are worth standing for," Robert said, echoing his earlier words about his father's choice. "Family is one of them. Land is another. If we don't make a stand somewhere, we'll be running forever." Elijah looked at the pressed flowers in Sarah's Bible, evidence of 2 decades spent nurturing hope in hidden places. Then he looked at his grandchildren, already learning skills they'd need to survive in a world where safety was never guaranteed. The time for hiding was ending. Whether they were ready or not, the final confrontation was approaching. The sound of approaching footsteps through the forest brought everyone to alert stillness. Robert's hand moved instinctively to the rifle beside his chair, while Emma gathered the children closer. But Copper's tail began wagging, and a moment later, a voice called softly from the darkness. "It's Webb, coming in." The man who emerged from the shadows looked nothing like Elijah had expected. Marcus Webb appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught attention, intelligent, watchful, carrying the weight of secrets and hard decisions. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Mr. Tull," Webb said, extending his hand, "I've been looking forward to this meeting for 20 years. Your wife and daughter speak of you constantly." "So you're the Guardian," Elijah replied, studying this man who'd saved his family while he'd mourned their deaths. I owe you more than I can repay. Webb's expression grew serious as he settled beside the fire. Actually, that's what I need to discuss. There have been developments that change everything we thought we knew about Carver's operation. He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of documents wrapped in oiled leather. I've been investigating the Carver Mining Company for 25 years, since before your family's accident. What I've discovered goes far beyond simple land grabbing. The first document he unfolded was an official death certificate dated February 1873, Sarah Elizabeth Tull and Emma Rose Tull, presumed dead by exposure following a winter storm. The paper looked authentic, complete with territorial seals and witness signatures. This was filed 3 days after I pulled your family from that ravine, Webb said quietly. I never reported finding them alive. According to territorial records, they died in that blizzard. Emma leaned forward, tension visible in every line of her body. You never told us about death certificates. Because I only found them last week, Webb replied, hidden in territorial archives that were supposed to be destroyed years ago. But that's not the worst of it. He spread out additional documents, more death certificates, dozens of them, all bearing the same official seals and signatures. Names Elijah didn't recognize, but the pattern was unmistakable. Families reported missing during suspicious accidents, all officially declared dead despite lack of bodies or conclusive evidence. The Henderson family disappeared during a rock slide that blocked their valley access. The Morrison clan lost when their cabin supposedly burned during a winter storm. The Chadwick settlement abandoned after a series of Indian attacks that local tribes deny any knowledge of. Webb's voice carried bitter anger. 47 families in 25 years, all officially dead, all coincidentally holding land claims that Carver's company acquired shortly after their disappearance. Robert whistled softly. 47 families. How many people? 183 individuals, including children. Webb's words fell like stones into the silence. Some were actually killed. I've found mass graves in 3 different locations. Others were driven away by threats and violence, their disappearances covered up by fraudulent death certificates. Your family was supposed to be in the first category. Elijah felt ice forming in his stomach. They meant to kill Sarah and Emma. The avalanche that blocked the road was triggered by explosives, Webb confirmed. I found the blast residue weeks later, but by then the story was already established. Terrible accident, tragic loss, no one to blame but bad weather. Except you survived long enough to see me coming, Mrs. Tull. He turned to address Emma directly. Your mother fought like a wildcat when I pulled you from that wagon, kept saying she had to get back to her husband, that he'd be looking for them. That's when I knew this family was different. Different how? Emma asked. Webb smiled grimly. Most people panic when they're told they're supposed to be dead. Your mother immediately started planning how to use that status to protect the people she loved. She understood that being officially deceased was the perfect cover for staying alive. The implications sank in slowly. Sarah hadn't just been hiding from Carver, she'd been legally dead for 20 years, unable to contact Elijah or return to normal life without exposing the larger conspiracy. Every year of separation had been necessary to protect not just their own family, but dozens of other families who'd found refuge in the hidden communities Webb had established. There's more, Webb continued, producing a final document that made Elijah's blood run cold. It was a geological survey of Dead Horse Ridge, dated just 3 months earlier, showing detailed mineral assessments and projected extraction values. Copper deposits worth an estimated $2 million. Webb read from the survey. Silver veins that could yield another $1 million. Your ridge isn't just valuable, Mr. Tull. It's the richest find Carver has identified in 5 years. Which means what? Exactly, Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Which means your death certificate is already being prepared. Webb said bluntly. Carver's men have been watching your ridge for weeks, mapping your routines, planning the accident that will claim your life and clear the way for corporate acquisition. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Grace had fallen asleep against Emma's shoulder, blissfully unaware that the adults around her were discussing life and death decisions that would shape her future. Michael continued whittling, his child's knife making careful cuts in the soft pine while his elders grappled with adult complexities. "How long do we have?" Robert asked. "Days, maybe a week," Webb replied. "My sources suggest they're planning to move soon, before winter weather makes the operation more difficult. Once they're ready, you'll face the same choice. 46 other families have faced disappear voluntarily or be disappeared permanently." Emma shifted the sleeping Grace in her arms, her face showing the struggle between protective instincts and righteous anger. 20 years we've been hiding while he picked off families one by one. How many more will die if we keep running? How many will die if we fight? Robert counted. Carver has money, political connections, hired killers. We have what moral authority? We have evidence, Webb said firmly. 20 years' worth of documents, witness statements, proof of the systematic murder and displacement that built Carver's empire. The territorial governor would have to act if presented with this information. Assuming the territorial governor isn't in Carver's pocket, Elijah pointed out. That's where you come in, Mr. Tull. Your military service, your reputation for integrity, people know you as someone who doesn't lie or exaggerate. Your word carries weight that mine doesn't. Elijah looked around the circle of firelight at the faces watching him, his daughter grown strong despite hardship, her husband ready to stand beside her, his PTM dot. Grandchildren who deserved better than a life spent looking over their shoulders. Beyond the fire's reach, Copper lay alert but relaxed, trusting in the humans who'd become his pack. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Webb leaned forward, his voice carrying the intensity of a man who'd waited decades to take action. "We stop running. We gather every piece of evidence, every witness, every family that's willing to come forward. We present the territorial governor with proof that can't be ignored or buried. And we do it before Carver can silence any more voices." "That sounds like a plan to get ourselves killed," Robert observed. "Maybe," Webb acknowledged. "But the alternative is watching him pick us off one by one while our children grow up as refugees in their own land. At some point, running becomes its own kind of death." Emma looked at her sleeping daughter, then at the pressed flowers in her mother's Bible. "Mama has been waiting 20 years to come home," she said, quietly. "Maybe it's time we stopped hiding and started fighting for the right to exist." The decision hung in the mountain air like morning mist, fragile but unavoidable. Around the fire, 3 generations of one family faced the choice between continued exile and a stand that might cost them everything but could also restore what had been stolen from dozens of others. In the end, it was Copper who decided them. The old dog rose from his resting place and moved to press against Elijah's leg, offering the same patient loyalty he'd provided for 20 years. But his eyes looked toward the direction of Dead Horse Ridge, toward home, as if he understood that some things were worth defending regardless of the cost. Dawn found Elijah sitting beside the dying fire, turning his grandfather's military compass over in his weathered hands. The brass instrument caught the early light, its needle pointing steadily north despite the emotional earthquake that had reshaped his world overnight. 20 years of isolation had taught him to think in terms of individual survival, but the compass reminded him of larger responsibilities, duty to family, to community, to principles that mattered more than personal safety. The army had taught him that successful operations required careful planning and clear objectives. As the others slept in their concealed shelters, Elijah applied those lessons to their current situation. Carver's strength lay in money, political connections, and the ability to operate in shadow while maintaining public respectability. Their advantages were knowledge, moral authority, and the element of surprise that came from an enemy believing his opponents were either dead or too frightened to act. Webb emerged from his shelter as the sun crested the eastern peaks, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to early mornings and difficult decisions. He settled beside Elijah without speaking, both men understanding the weight of what lay ahead. "Second thoughts?" Webb asked finally. "Plenty," Elijah replied. "But not about our decision, about our methods. You're thinking like an investigator, gather evidence, present facts, trust the system to work. I'm thinking like a soldier who's learned that evil men don't surrender just because you prove they're evil." Webb studied him carefully. "What are you suggesting? That we plan for what happens when Carver refuses to accept legal consequences, when he decides it's easier to eliminate the witnesses than face justice?" Elijah held up the compass, watching sunlight play across its face. "This belonged to my grandfather, who fought in 3 Indian wars and lived to tell about them. He taught me that sometimes you have to meet violence with strength, or it just keeps coming. Your family's been hidden for 20 years specifically to avoid that kind of confrontation. My family's been hidden for 20 years, while 46 other families died or disappeared." Elijah corrected. "That approach preserved some lives but didn't save anyone. Maybe it's time to try something different." Emma approached from the direction of the stream, carrying water for coffee and moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made peace with difficult choices during the night's rest. She'd inherited Sarah's practical nature, the kind of intelligence that saw problems clearly and worked towards solutions rather than dwelling on obstacles. "Robert's checking the perimeter," she reported. "Webb's sources were right. There are tracks from yesterday that don't belong to any of us. Someone's been watching this place." The news confirmed what Elijah had suspected since seeing the geological survey of his ridge. Carver's operation was already in motion, the machinery of elimination beginning to turn. Whatever plan they developed would need to account for immediate threats as well as long-term justice. "How many men does Carver typically use for this kind of work?" Elijah asked Webb. "Depends on the situation. For isolated targets, maybe 3 or 4 professionals. For larger operations, he's used as many as a dozen. But he prefers situations that look like accidents, rock slides, building fires, exposure deaths, clean resolutions that don't invite investigation. Which means he'll want to separate us," Emma observed. "Deal with each family individually rather than face organized resistance." Robert returned through the trees, rifle in hand and expression grim. 5 men minimum, probably more. Professional hunters, not local cowboys looking for quick money. They've got our position marked, but they're keeping distance for now." Webb cursed softly. "They're not supposed to move for another few days. Something's accelerated their timeline." "Or someone leaked information about our meeting," Elijah said, studying the tactical situation with eyes trained by decades of mountain living and military experience. The camp's position was defensible but not ideal. Too many approaches, limited escape routes, children who couldn't move quickly through difficult terrain. "We need to get the families to safety first," Emma said, maternal instincts overriding tactical considerations. "Grace and Michael can't be here if this turns violent." "Where's safe?" Robert asked. "If Carver knows about this place, he probably knows about Haven Valley too." The question hung in the morning air like gunpowder smoke. 20 years of careful concealment might have been compromised by a single informant or a moment's carelessness. The network Webb had built to protect displaced families could become a trap if Carver had infiltrated their communications. "There's another option," Elijah said slowly, an idea forming as he watched his compass needle hold steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "We stop hiding and start hunting." "Meaning what exactly?" Webb asked. "Meaning we use their expectations against them. They think they're stalking isolated families who'll run or hide when threatened. They're not prepared for organized resistance." Emma caught the implication immediately. "You want to turn this into a military operation?" "I want to turn this into justice," Elijah corrected. But yes, that might require military methods. Carver's been getting away with murder for 25 years because his victims were always unprepared, always reactive. What happens when he faces people who shoot back? The conversation paused as Grace and Michael emerged from their shelter, sleepy and hungry, but adapting to their changed circumstances with the resilience children showed when adults projected calm confidence. Emma moved to tend them while the men continued planning, the domestic routine providing stability against an uncertain future. Webb spread his documents on a flat stone, using them as a map to illustrate Carver's operation. His base camp is about 15 miles north of here, in a valley that controls access to most of the disputed mining claims. Maybe 20 men total, but they're spread across multiple sites. The core group, Carver himself and his closest operatives, rarely leave the main camp. Defensible position? Robert asked. Very. Single entrance, high walls, plenty of supplies. Built like a small fort, which is probably what it is. Elijah studied the layout, applying lessons learned in army campaigns against entrenched positions. Hard to assault directly, but that kind of position has weaknesses. Limited mobility, dependence on supply lines, communication problems with scattered units. You're talking about a war, Webb said quietly. Carver's been conducting a war for 25 years, Elijah replied. The only difference is that now someone's ready to fight back. Emma rejoined them, leaving the children occupied with breakfast and wooden toys. Whatever we decide, it has to account for the other families. Haven Valley has 37 people, including 16 children. They can't defend themselves against professional killers. Then we draw the killers away, Robert suggested. Make ourselves the target, lead them away from the innocents. Or we end the threat permanently, Elijah said. Cut off the head and the snake dies. Webb looked troubled by the direction their planning was taking. I spent 20 years documenting Carver's crimes, specifically to avoid this kind of bloodshed. Legal justice, not vigilante violence. Legal justice requires a legal system that works, Emma pointed out. How many territorial officials has Carver bought or intimidated? How many judges will rule against him if he makes it clear their families might suffer accidents? The question touched the heart of their dilemma. Carver's power rested not just on violence but on corruption, the systematic purchase of officials who should have protected the people he victimized. Traditional legal remedies might work eventually, but only if enough witnesses survived to testify, and only if the system itself wasn't compromised beyond repair. There's a middle path, Elijah said finally. We gather the evidence Webb's collected, prepare legal documents that can't be ignored. But we also prepare for the fight that comes when Carver tries to eliminate the witnesses. Self-defense isn't murder, and protecting families isn't vigilante justice. Copper raised his head from where he'd been dozing beside the fire, ears pricked toward the southern approach. The dog's alert posture sent ripples of tension through the camp. Someone was coming, and soon. Webb gathered his documents quickly, while Robert and Emma moved toward their children with the practiced efficiency of parents who'd learned to respond instantly to danger signals. But it was Elijah who remained calm, compass steady in his hands as he considered the pieces moving toward confrontation. Time for talking is over, he said quietly. Now we see if 20 years of hiding taught us enough to survive 20 minutes of fighting. The compass needle pointed north, toward the high country where he'd built his life around solitude and sorrow. But today, it would guide them toward something else entirely, toward justice, toward family, toward the kind of reckoning that determined whether evil triumphed through patient persistence or fell before determined resistance. In the distance, Copper's low growl announced the approach of men who carried death in their intentions and violence in their hearts. The mountain morning that had begun with hope and reunion was about to test whether love could survive when forced to defend itself against those who profited from its destruction. The rescue operation began at sunset, when mountain shadows provided cover for movement through terrain that favored defenders over attackers. Webb had confirmed Sarah's location, a hidden valley 3 miles north, where she tended her secret garden and waited for word that her family's reunion had gone safely. But Carver's men had found her first. Elijah moved through the forest like smoke, 20 years of solitude having taught him to read every shift in wind and shadow. Beside him, Robert proved equally skilled at wilderness movement, while Webb provided tactical intelligence gathered from decades of observing Carver's methods. They made an unlikely team, a grieving hermit, a displaced surveyor's son, and a former government agent united by love for the same scattered family. The valley appeared peaceful from the ridge overlooking Sarah's hidden sanctuary. Terraced gardens stepped down the hillside, filled with the flowers she'd cultivated as living memories of her lost life. A small cabin sat nestled among apple trees that bore fruit despite the mountain's harsh climate. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line that spoke of domestic tranquility. But Copper's tension told a different story. The dog's hackles remained raised, his nose twitching at scents that carried threat rather than welcome. 2 horses were tethered near the cabin, animals that didn't belong to Sarah or anyone else from Haven Valley. "How many?" Robert whispered. Webb studied the scene through field glasses, counting details that meant nothing to civilian eyes but spoke volumes to someone trained in surveillance. 3 inside, probably 1 posted as lookout. Standard intimidation pattern, enough force to control the situation, not enough to attract attention if neighbors investigate. Elijah felt his old military instincts awakening. 20 years of rust falling away as tactical thinking engaged with emotional urgency. Sarah was alive but threatened, alone with men who saw her as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person deserving protection. The mathematics of violence were simple. Surprise and superior position could overcome numerical advantage, but only if executed with precision that allowed no mistakes. "I'll take the lookout," he said, quietly. "Give me 10 minutes to get into position, then create a distraction at the front door. When the shooting starts, Copper and I will come through the back." "This isn't a military operation," Webb protested. "These are criminals, not enemy soldiers." "Tell that to the 47 families they've murdered," Elijah replied, checking his rifle's action with movements made automatic by decades of practice. "Right now, the only thing standing between my wife and a shallow grave is how much noise we're willing to make." Robert nodded grimly. "Emma's counting on us to bring her mother home safely, whatever it takes." The approach to the cabin tested every stealth skill Elijah had learned in 30 years of mountain living. The lookout had positioned himself well, good sight lines in multiple directions, back protected by a large boulder that provided cover from rifle fire. But he'd made the amateur's mistake of assuming threats would come from expected directions, failing to account for the patient hunter willing to spend an hour covering 50 yards of difficult ground. When Elijah finally got close enough to strike, the man never knew what hit him. A rifle butt to the base of the skull dropped him unconscious without the noise that would have alerted his companions. Military training from decades past guided Elijah's movements as he secured the lookout's weapons and positioned himself for the assault to come. Sarah's voice carried through the cabin's thin walls, steady despite obvious fear. "I've told you everything I know. My husband is dead, has been dead for 20 years. If you're looking for him, you're wasting everyone's time." "Maybe," came a rougher voice in response. "But Thomas Carver doesn't like loose ends, and you're definitely loose. Whether your husband's alive or dead, you know too much about families that are supposed to be dead too." Elijah felt rage building in his chest like wildfire, the controlled fury of a man who'd lost 2, much to tolerate further threats against those he loved. These men had separated him from his family for 20 years, had built their fortune on the graves of innocents, had turned his wife into a refugee in her own homeland. Webb and Robert appeared at the cabin's front corner, moving with the careful coordination they'd planned. At Webb's signal, Robert called out in an authoritative voice. "Territorial marshals, come out with your hands visible." The response was immediate, shouting from inside the cabin, the sound of furniture overturning as men sought cover. But in the confusion, Elijah heard something that made his heart stop. Sarah's voice, clear and strong despite 20 years of separation. "Elijah, is that really you?" Through the cabin's back window, he saw her grey-haired now, but unmistakably the woman he'd married 30 years earlier. She sat tied to a chair near the fireplace, face showing the bruises of rough handling, but eyes bright with intelligence and hope. Around her neck, on the same chain she'd worn since their wedding day, hung her wedding ring, the match to the one Elijah had carried against his heart through 20 years of mourning. "It's me, Sarah," he called back, his voice carrying across decades of separation. "I'm coming to take you home." The reunion he'd dreamed of for 20 years was about to begin with gunfire and violence, but Sarah's smile told him she understood. Some things were worth fighting for, and family stood at the top of that list. The final confrontation erupted with the sudden violence of a mountain thunderstorm. Gunfire shattered the evening calm as Carver's men responded to Webb's challenge with bullets instead of surrender. But they hadn't counted on facing organized resistance from people who knew the terrain and fought for reasons deeper than money. Elijah crashed through the cabin's back door just as Emma appeared at the front, her arrival perfectly timed despite the chaos. She moved with lethal efficiency, rifle in hand, and determination written across features that combined the best of both parents. Behind her came a dozen men and women from Haven Valley families who'd spent 20 years hiding but had finally chosen to stand and fight. "Emma?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief as she saw her daughter for the first time in 2 decades. "Hello, Mama," Emma replied, her rifle never wavering from the man who'd been threatening Sarah moments before. "Sorry we're late." The cabin exploded into motion as Carver's men realized they faced not isolated victims, but coordinated attackers who'd planned this assault with military precision. But Robert had positioned himself to cut off their escape routes, while Webb's knowledge of their operational methods allowed him to anticipate their responses. In the midst of the firefight, Elijah heard a sound that cut through gunshots and shouting like music through noise. Emma's childhood harmonica, the one he'd given her for her 3rd birthday, playing a simple melody that had once been their secret signal during games of hide and seek. She was using it now to coordinate the attack, the clear notes telling everyone where to move and when. "That's my girl," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched their daughter lead the charge against the men who'd held her captive. Elijah cut Sarah's bonds with swift knife strokes, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of touching his wife after 20 years of believing her dead. She felt real and solid and alive in ways that made his chest tight with emotions too large for words. "We have to move," he said, helping her stand on legs cramped from hours of restraint. "This isn't over yet." Through the cabin windows, they could see the battle spreading across the valley. More of Carver's men were arriving, the main force responding to the gunfire with reinforcements that outnumbered the families 3-1. But Emma had planned for this contingency, using the terrain and pre-positioned supplies to turn Sarah's Garden Valley into a fortress that favored defenders over attackers. "Thomas Carver's coming himself," Webb shouted over the noise of combat. "My sources say he's leading a dozen men up the main trail." Emma's harmonica sounded again, this time playing the melody that meant "gather close," a signal every child in Haven Valley had learned for emergencies. The scattered fighters began converging on the cabin, forming a defensive perimeter that would allow them to make their stand together. But it was Copper who provided the tactical advantage nobody had anticipated. The old dog had spent 20 years learning every game trail and hidden approach in these mountains. And now he used that knowledge to guide Haven Valley's younger men into flanking positions that turned Carver's numerical advantage into a liability. "He's herding them like sheep," Robert observed with admiration as Copper appeared and disappeared through the undergrowth, always staying just visible enough to draw pursuit in the wrong directions. The sound of approaching horses announced Carver's arrival, a man in his 60s who rode like someone accustomed to commanding others to do his violent work. He brought with him not just hired killers, but the corrupt authority of purchased badges and political connections. Behind him rode territorial deputies who'd sold their oaths for Carver's gold. "This ends now," Carver called across the valley, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "You people are trespassing on private land, threatening legitimate business interests. Surrender now, and you'll be treated according to territorial law." Emma's response was to play a defiant tune on her harmonica, not a signal this time, but the melody Elijah had taught her years earlier, a song about standing firm against storm winds. The clear notes carried across the valley like a battle cry, telling everyone within hearing that some things couldn't be bought or intimidated into submission. "That's my daughter," Sarah said proudly, watching Emma coordinate the defense with skill that spoke of natural leadership developed through necessity. The final assault began at full dark, with Carver's forces attacking from multiple directions in an attempt to overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and firepower. But they underestimated both the tactical advantages of prepared positions and the fighting spirit of people defending their families against those who'd already taken too much. In the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting voices, Elijah found himself fighting alongside his wife and daughter for the first time in their lives, 3 generations of the same family united in resistance against the forces that had scattered them across 20 years of unnecessary exile. The harmonica's melody rose above the gunfire like hope itself, calling them home to each other despite the violence surrounding their reunion. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, revealing the aftermath of a battle that had changed everything. Thomas Carver sat bound beside the cold ashes of Sarah's garden fire, his empire of fear and corruption reduced to the testimony of witnesses who would no longer be silenced. Webb's carefully preserved evidence lay spread across a makeshift table, 20 years of documentation that would ensure justice finally found its mark. 6 months later, Elijah stood on the porch of a new cabin built where the mysterious shelter had first appeared, watching his grandchildren play in the meadow where their parents had once faced armed killers. The territorial governor's investigation had dismantled Carver's operation completely, revealing corruption that reached into the highest levels of mining and political circles. But more importantly, it had freed 47 families from the shadows of exile and fear. Grace ran toward him, carrying something precious in her small hands, a new family photograph taken just that morning, showing 3 generations gathered on the cabin steps, with Copper sprawling contentedly in the foreground. The image captured everything Elijah had thought lost forever. Sarah's gentle smile, Emma's confident strength, Robert's steady presence, and the children who connected past and future in an unbroken chain of love and memory. "Grandpa Bear," Grace called, using the name that had evolved naturally from Emma's childhood memories. "Mama says you need to see this." The photograph was perfect in ways that professional portraits rarely achieved, not because of technical skill, but because it captured genuine happiness in faces that had learned to value what they'd nearly lost. Sarah's hair was silver now, instead of brown, and lines mapped the geography of 20 years across all their faces, but their eyes held the same light that had drawn them together in the first place. Emma approached from the garden where she'd been working beside her mother, both women tending flowers that no longer needed to hide their beauty in secret valleys. The sight of them together, mother and daughter, sharing the daily work that connected them to the earth and each other, filled Elijah with contentment deeper than any he'd known during his years of solitude. "The lawyer from Helena sent word," Emma said, wiping soil from her hands with the practical movements of someone who'd learned to value honest work. "Carver's conviction is final. 25 years in territorial prison, with restitution payments to all the displaced families." Robert emerged from the barn, where he'd been teaching Michael the basics of caring for the horses they'd acquired to work their expanded homestead. The boy showed natural skill with animals, the kind of patient gentleness that suggested he'd inherited the best qualities from both sides of his family. "Justice served," Robert said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "But the real victory is this." He gestured toward the scene around them, family working together, children playing safely, a home built on land they could claim without fear of midnight visits from hired killers. Sarah joined them on the porch, moving with the grace of a woman who'd learned to appreciate each day's simple blessings. She carried a letter that bore the territorial seal, official confirmation that the homestead claims of all displaced families had been validated and protected under new laws designed to prevent future abuses. "Marcus sends his regards," she said, referring to Webb, who'd accepted a position as territorial inspector charged with preventing future mining company violations. "He's investigating claims in the northern districts now, making sure other families don't face what we endured." Elijah wrapped his arm around Sarah's shoulders, marveling at how naturally they fell back into the taut rhythm of shared affection despite the decades that had intervened. Some bonds transcended time and circumstance, proving stronger than the forces that sought to break them. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked quietly. The kind of question married couples learn to ask when major life changes demanded honest assessment. Elijah considered the question seriously while watching his grandchildren chase butterflies through wildflowers that bloomed openly instead of hiding in secret gardens. The solitary life on Dead Horse Ridge had provided peace and safety, but it had also been a kind of living death existence without the connections that gave meaning to daily struggles. "Only one," he said finally, "that it took 20 years to find our way back to each other." "We were always connected," Sarah replied, touching the wedding ring that now hung openly on its chain rather than hidden beneath layers of careful concealment. "Geography couldn't change that, and neither could time. The love was always there, waiting for the right moment to bring us home." Copper appeared from his patrol of the property boundaries, red coat bright in the morning sunlight, as he trotted toward them with the satisfied air of a job well done. The old dog had adapted to pack life more easily than anyone expected, treating the expanded family as a larger version of the bond he'd shared with Elijah for 2 decades. Emma sat on the porch, steps with her children, pulling out the wooden chess set she'd completed during the years of exile. Each piece showed the careful craftsmanship that connected her to her father's teachings, but the designs reflected her own artistic vision developed through independent growth and experience. "Ready for that game you promised me 20 years ago?" she asked, setting up the board with pieces that told the story of their family's separation and reunion. As they arranged the carved figures for battle, Elijah realized that some victories couldn't be measured in terms of tactical success or legal justice. The real triumph lay in the photograph Grace treasured, in the garden where 3 generations worked together, in the simple fact that his family had survived the worst that evil men could inflict and emerged stronger for the struggle. The new family photograph would hang in the place of honor above the fireplace, but it wouldn't be the last such image. There would be birthday celebrations to document, holidays to commemorate, and quiet moments of daily life that deserved preservation. Most importantly, there would be stories to tell, tales of courage and endurance that would pass from grandparents to grandchildren, ensuring that future generations understood the value of what had been preserved through 2 decades of patient hope. Outside the cabin windows, the mountain wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of seasons yet to come, while inside, a family that had been scattered by greed and fear settled into the rhythm of love, restored.